They tore down my family cemetery fence to run a pipeline through my property, and less than a year later, the entire project was dead in the water. I know that sounds dramatic, maybe even a little unbelievable, but I lived every second of it. And if there's one thing I learned through all of this, it's that some people get so used to bulldozing their way through life they honestly forget not every piece of land is just dirt on a map. My name's Daniel Mercer. I live outside Willow Creek, Kentucky, on 72 acres that have been in my family for longer than anybody alive can remember. Rolling pasture, hardwood trees, a narrow creek cutting through the western edge, the kind of place where mornings feel slow and honest. My grandfather used to say land talks if you spend enough quiet time on it. I thought that sounded ridiculous when I was younger, but the older I get, the more I think he was right. Toward the east side of my property sits a little family cemetery, tucked beneath old oak trees. 14 graves. The oldest marker dates back to 1849. My great-great-grandfather Elias Mercer was buried there after coming back from the Mexican-American War. There's a baby buried there too. One of his daughters lived 11 days. The cemetery is surrounded by a black wrought iron fence put in sometime around 1904. Hand-forged, decorative corners, heavy iron posts sunk deep. It's beautiful in an old-fashioned way, and it matters. That cemetery is protected under state historical burial law. Registered, surveyed, documented. The fence too. Nobody touches it. For 25 years I've kept that ground clean myself. Every spring I clear vines, reset stones that lean after winter frost, trim brush. I know every inch of that little hill, every name carved into stone, every patch where grass grows thinner than the rest. Then North Ridge Energy showed up. They were building a natural gas pipeline through several counties. Big project, big money, 38 miles total. Their land acquisition rep called first. Friendly enough. Then a week later a project manager named Brett Holloway drove out with a survey crew. Brett looked exactly like the kind of man you picture handling million-dollar construction projects. Pressed button-down shirt, sunglasses, tablet in one hand, smile that never quite reached his eyes. He shook my hand and said, "Mr. Mercer, appreciate your time. We've reviewed your parcel, and we've got a route that should work without disrupting anything meaningful." That phrase stuck with me. Without disrupting anything meaningful. He stood there pointing at his screen, tracing a line across my property. The route ran south of the cemetery. Plenty of room. I stopped him and asked directly, "How close?" He zoomed in. "About 75 feet. I asked him again, "And your crew stays clear?" "Absolutely. Contract includes a 50-foot protected buffer around the cemetery. No machinery. No excavation. No disturbance." He said it smooth. Immediate. Like he'd rehearsed it. I looked over the easement paperwork with my attorney, Laura Bennett. Laura had known my family forever. Sharp as a tack and mean in court in the best possible way. She tapped the paragraph and said, "This language protects you. If they violate this, they're exposed." I signed. North Ridge signed. Everything legal. Everything documented. And for 8 months, nothing happened. Life stayed simple. I repaired a fence line by the barn. My neighbor Hank brought over tomatoes bigger than softballs. We had thunderstorms roll through in April and watched the creek rise. I spent Memorial Day cleaning the cemetery like always, replacing flowers and brushing leaves off old stones. I remember standing there that afternoon looking at the iron fence catching sunlight through the trees and thinking how peaceful everything felt. That thought lasted maybe 6 weeks. Construction started mid-July. You could hear it from across the property. Engines. Backup alarms. Steel rattling. Annoying, sure, but expected. Then around 10:30 one morning Hank called. Didn't even say hello. Just said, "Dan, you need to get over here right now." Something in his voice hit me immediately. I asked what happened. He said, "They're too damn close." That was enough. I left my truck running halfway through the gate and cut across the field on foot. And what I saw? I still remember it frame by frame. The fence was gone. Not moved. Not carefully dismantled. Gone. Bent black iron twisted across bare dirt like scrap metal. Posts ripped clean out. One decorative corner smashed flat beneath a track excavator. Fresh trenching cut through the protected zone. Closer than it had any right to be. Maybe 15 feet from the nearest grave. There were machine tracks crossing ground nobody had any business touching. For a second I genuinely couldn't move. My chest got tight. My hands started shaking. Not anger first. Something deeper. Like somebody had kicked open your front door and walked through your family photo albums with muddy boots. Then I saw Brett, standing near the trench with his tablet. Calm as could be. I walked straight toward him. He looked up and said, "Daniel, hey." I cut him off. "What happened to my fence?" He glanced over his shoulder like he was mildly inconvenienced. "Oh yeah? Field conditions changed. We adjusted route placement." I stared at him. "You destroyed a protected cemetery barrier." He gave this little shrug. "We had bedrock issues. Crew needed flexibility. We'll reinstall fencing afterward." I actually laughed. Couldn't help it. Not because it was funny. Because the audacity was unreal. I said, "You're 15 feet from a grave." He lifted the tablet like the answer was sitting there. "We're still within operational parameters." Operational parameters. I'll never forget that phrase. I looked past him at the trench, then back at him. "You stop this now." He folded his arms. "Can't do that." I pulled my phone out and started taking pictures. Every angle. The trench. The iron. Track marks. Equipment. Crew placement. Brett stepped closer. "Daniel, let's not escalate this." I said, "You escalated it when your machine crossed onto burial ground." He looked annoyed now. Like I was the difficult one. I called Laura. She answered on the second ring. I didn't explain much. Just sent photos. 30 seconds later my phone rang back. Her voice had changed. Sharp. Fast. "Daniel, tell them to shut everything down right now." I looked toward Brett. Laura kept talking. "And listen carefully, do not let anybody move another inch." I asked, "How bad is this?" There was half a second of silence. Then she said, very calmly, "Bad enough I'm calling a judge." I stood there with Laura still on speaker, staring at Brett, while an excavator idled behind him and diesel fumes drifted through oak trees that had been standing over my family cemetery for more than 100 years. The contrast felt surreal. Machinery rumbling, iron twisted in the dirt, and my attorney talking like somebody had just lit a fuse. Laura said, "Daniel, listen to me carefully. This isn't a contract dispute anymore. This is cemetery law, historical site law, and depending on how far they cross that line, potentially criminal." Brett heard enough of that to straighten up. He stepped closer and lowered his voice. "You really don't want to make this bigger than it needs to be." I almost laughed again. I looked around at the trench cut through protected ground and said, "A little late for that." He sighed like I was exhausting him. Then he waved toward his foreman. "Keep moving." That right there. That was the moment this whole thing became something neither of us could walk back. I raised my voice. "Nobody touches another machine." The foreman froze. Brett turned. "Continue." The bucket on that excavator lifted. I swear to God Laura somehow heard it through the phone because she snapped, "Daniel, put me on speaker." I did. Her voice came through loud enough for everybody nearby. "This is Attorney Laura Bennett representing Daniel Mercer. You have documented violation of a protected cemetery zone. If any operator moves equipment after this warning, I will personally name every individual involved in the injunction filing this afternoon." The entire crew stopped. No one said a word. Brett looked furious. Then he leaned toward my phone. "You don't have authority to stop an active state-approved construction site." Laura answered immediately. "Watch me." He muttered something under his breath I won't repeat. Then he stepped away and started making calls. I kept taking pictures. Close-ups. Measurements. I found one broken iron section bent nearly in half with rust patterns still visible where my grandfather had painted over spots years ago. I picked it up and honestly had to set it back down because my hands were shaking too badly. Hank came over from the field and stood beside me. Didn't say much. Just looked. Then quietly said, "Your granddad would lose his mind seeing this." I nodded. That hit hard. About 40 minutes later sheriff's deputies rolled in. 2 cruisers. Dust cloud down the access road. Deputy Calloway got out first. Big guy. Older. Had known me since high school. He took one look at the trench. Then at the cemetery. Then at Brett. Everybody shut it down. Brett walked toward him fast. "We're fully permitted." Calloway held up paperwork. "Judge signed an emergency cease work order 10 minutes ago." Brett blinked. Actually blinked. Like his brain refused to process it. Then he tried again. "This project has state authorization." Calloway didn't even raise his voice. "And now it has a court order. Turn off every machine." One by one the engines died. That sound. I still remember it. A whole construction corridor going silent. No diesel. No hydraulics. Just cicadas and leaves moving in the trees. Laura arrived about an hour later carrying a legal pad and wearing that expression she got before absolutely dismantling somebody. She walked the site with me, measured buffer distances, photographed everything herself. When she saw tire tracks cutting near the oldest stones, she stopped cold. Then she turned toward Brett and asked, "Who approved route deviation?" He tried staying confident. "Field engineering." She asked, "Documented?" "Yes." "Show me." He hesitated. That was all she needed. By sunset, she'd filed breach of contract, violation of cemetery preservation law, emergency property damage claims, and a petition through the state historical registry. The next morning, state investigators showed up. Then another agency. Then another. 3 SUVs by noon. Environmental division. Historical preservation. Burial protection. A geologist too. That surprised me. A woman named Rebecca Shaw from the Geological Survey. Smart, direct, boots already muddy. Brett repeated his story about bedrock forcing route adjustment. Rebecca walked the trench with her instruments. Checked depth. Checked soil. Took samples. Then she stood up and brushed dirt off her hands. "No bedrock," Brett said. "Our report," she cut him off. "There is no bedrock here." He tried again. "Maybe deeper." She looked annoyed. "No," then she added. "Not even close." That changed the whole tone. Because suddenly this wasn't an unfortunate field adjustment. Now it looked intentional. Cheap shortcut. Laura looked at me and quietly said, "That's what we needed." Historical preservation inspected the fence remains. A guy named Walter Pierce spent nearly 2 hours cataloging pieces. He got visibly irritated the longer he looked. Finally he said, "This isn't ordinary fencing." He pointed at decorative iron scrollwork. Period-specific forging. Early 20th century. Custom. Then he looked at Brett. "Did your crew know what this was?" Brett stayed quiet. Walter wrote notes. A lot of notes. By the third day, the state formally classified the fence as protected historical infrastructure requiring full restoration. Not replacement. Restoration. Exact replica. Period-correct ironwork. Hand fabrication. Estimated cost just shy of $90,000. And honestly, that was still just the appetizer. Because once state regulators start pulling permits apart, they tend to keep pulling. North Ridge needed approvals across multiple counties. Environmental permits. Waterway permits. Federal land crossing reviews. Wildlife compliance. Historical preservation compliance. And now every single agency involved started reopening files. Turns out my cemetery wasn't the only corner they'd cut. Inspectors found erosion barriers installed wrong near Pine Hollow Creek. Unauthorized crossing equipment near wetlands. Protected salamander habitat disturbed along county line. A drainage ditch that didn't match filed plans. 1 violation became 5. 5 became 12. 12 became a full review. News spread fast. First local paper. Then county radio. Then regional business reports. Headlines about burial ground violations and permit investigations. Investors hate headlines. Especially headlines involving words like desecration and emergency injunction. Brett came back to my place 5 days later. No crew. No tablet. No smile. Just him standing on my porch around 7 in the evening. I stepped outside. He looked tired. For the first time since I met him, he looked like somebody carrying real weight. He said, "Daniel, we can resolve this." I leaned against the railing. "Can we? We'll rebuild the fence." "With what? Our contractors?" "No," he stopped. I looked him right in the eye. "You don't get to bulldoze through a cemetery, then offer contractor-grade cleanup like you dented a mailbox." His jaw tightened. "This project matters to a lot of people." I nodded. So did my family. He looked past me toward the cemetery trees. Then back. "You realize if regulators suspend the corridor, hundreds of jobs get hit." That one was calculated. He wanted guilt. Wanted me to back off. And for a second, I'll be honest, I felt it. Because regular workers hadn't made this call. Equipment operators didn't decide to cut corners. But then I pictured twisted iron lying in dirt and tire tracks beside gravestones. And I remembered him shrugging. Field conditions changed. That line. That casual little shrug. I said, "You had a legal route." He didn't answer. "You had a signed agreement." Nothing. "You had protected land clearly marked." Still nothing. Then finally I asked the one thing he couldn't dodge. "Did you move the line because it was cheaper?" His eyes gave him away before his mouth did. Just for a second. But enough. He looked down and quietly said, It saved time. I nodded once. There it was. No geology. No emergency. No unavoidable engineering challenge. Time. Money. Convenience. He looked back up. Daniel, I interrupted him. Get off my porch. He stood there maybe 3 more seconds, then walked away. That same night Laura called. Her voice sounded almost amused. Thought you'd want to know. I asked, what now? State Environmental Department just suspended every active construction permit tied to North Ridge's corridor. I sat down hard in the porch chair. What? All of it. Effective immediately. I looked toward the dark tree line where the cemetery sat under moonlight. Laura continued. No digging. No crossings. No construction. Entire project frozen pending full review. I asked how bad it was. She said, bad enough their lenders are panicking. Then she paused and added one sentence I'll never forget. Daniel, I think this thing's about to get expensive. Expensive turned out to be an understatement. For the next few weeks, North Ridge Energy looked less like a company building a pipeline and more like a building with every alarm going off at once. Lawyers everywhere. Regulators asking for documents. Investors demanding updates. Local reporters parked outside county offices waiting for statements. Every couple days something new surfaced, and every new detail somehow made the last one look worse. Laura kept me updated almost daily. Some mornings she'd call before I even finished coffee. Daniel, they failed stream crossing inspections in Mason County. Or, Daniel, Federal Wildlife Review just got reopened. Or my personal favorite, Daniel. Apparently one of their permit maps doesn't match field routes in 3 separate parcels. At one point I asked her if North Ridge had anybody actually running the company. She laughed and said, I'm starting to wonder. Meanwhile, life on my land got quiet again. The trench sat unfinished. Temporary barriers went up. Equipment disappeared. And every evening I walked out to the cemetery. The damaged sections of fence had been carefully gathered and cataloged by the preservation team. Wooden markers stood where each iron post had originally been. It looked strange, like the outline of something wounded. I'd bring a folding chair sometimes and just sit there while the sun dropped behind the trees. I thought about my grandfather. Thought about all the years I watched him brush leaves off those stones like he was checking in on family. He used to say, respect the dead and the living usually sort themselves out. At the time I thought that sounded like old country wisdom somebody puts on a coffee mug. Turns out he may have been onto something. About 6 weeks after the shutdown, Hank drove over and climbed out of his truck grinning. He held up his phone. You seeing this? I wasn't. He handed me the screen. Regional Utility Partners, North Ridge's primary buyer, had canceled the supply agreement. Just pulled out. Signed with another provider. I read it twice. Then looked at Hank. He whistled low. That's gotta hurt. And yeah, it hurt. Pipeline projects can survive delays. They can survive lawsuits. Sometimes even regulatory penalties. What they don't survive very well is losing the customer paying for the whole thing. That contract disappearing sent shockwaves. North Ridge stockholders started bailing. Lenders tightened financing. Subcontractors began filing payment concerns. The local rumor mill absolutely exploded. At the feed store, people talked about it near the register. At church parking lots, folks brought it up before Sunday service. One guy at the hardware store looked at me and said, "You really took down a pipeline with a cemetery fence?" I told him, technically they did. That got a laugh. Even I had to admit the whole thing felt surreal. Because this had never been about revenge. Not really. I wasn't sitting around plotting some grand takedown. I just wanted them to leave sacred ground alone. That was it. Honor the agreement. Respect the place. Keep the promise they made. They were the ones who decided saving time mattered more. And once the system started looking closely, well, apparently there was a whole lot worth looking at. By early spring, restoration on the cemetery finally began. North Ridge was legally ordered to fund every penny. The Preservation Commission hired a blacksmith named Martin Graves from Tennessee. Older guy, hands like tree roots. Quiet. He spent hours studying photos of the original fence, measuring decorative curves, matching iron thickness, even reproducing tiny hammer marks so it looked period correct. I stood nearby one afternoon while he adjusted a section. He looked over and said, "Whoever built the first one knew what they were doing." I smiled. My great-grandfather probably stood here watching. Martin nodded. Then we'll make sure he'd approve. That one got me. A month later, installation started. Piece by piece. Post by post. By the end of the week, the cemetery looked whole again. Actually better than before in some ways. Not newer. Just honored. Like history had been stitched back together. I stood at the gate one evening with sunlight catching fresh black iron and the old stones behind it. Wind moving through oak leaves. Birds settling. Quiet. Real quiet. The kind that feels earned. Then my phone rang. Laura. I answered. She didn't waste time. Northridge filed Chapter 11 this morning. I leaned against the fence. Didn't say anything. She continued. Project financing collapsed. Main customer gone. Permit suspension still active. Investors backed out. I finally asked, that it? She exhaled. That's pretty much it. I looked through the bars of that rebuilt gate toward 14 graves and a patch of family history that nearly got treated like a shortcut. And I felt, honestly, less triumphant than people probably expect. No cheering. No celebration. No revenge movie soundtrack playing in my head. Just relief. And maybe something else. A reminder. Because powerful companies get used to thinking land is acreage, lines, paperwork, deadlines. Move this. Cut through that. Shift the route. Save a little time. But some places aren't numbers. Some places carry names. And memory. And weight. And if you ignore that long enough, eventually somebody notices. A few days later Brett showed up one last time. No company truck. No polished boots. Just jeans and a tired face. He stood outside the gate and looked at the rebuilt fence. For a minute neither of us said anything. Then he quietly said, "It looks good." I nodded. "It does." He kept staring, then said, "I should have stopped them that day." First honest thing I'd ever heard from him. I asked, "Why didn't you?" He gave a dry little laugh. "Because I thought we were behind schedule. And I thought one fence wasn't worth slowing down." He shook his head, then looked at the cemetery. Turns out I was wrong. I didn't answer. Didn't need to. He stood there another second, then turned and walked back to his truck. And that was it. Never saw him again. These days when I walk out there early in the morning and see sunlight hitting that iron fence, I still think about how close we came. How easy it would have been for me to ignore Hank's call, or wait until tomorrow, or believe promises after the damage was done. And I think about how one careless decision, one shortcut ended up costing an entire energy company everything. So I've got to ask, if somebody bulldozed through your family cemetery because it was faster and cheaper, what would you have done? Would you have settled for an apology and a repair check? Or would you have pushed until every last permit got reviewed? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to hear where you land on that. And if you like stories where greed gets called out and shortcuts come back hard, hit like, subscribe, and stick around for the next one.